everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for episode 4 and maybe 2 of season 6 of the Revise and Resubmit podcast. I'm Dr. Kim Bissell, the Southern Progress Endowed Professor in Magazine Journalism and the Associate Dean for Research in the College of Communication and Information Sciences at the University of Alabama.
And I'm Dr. Annalisa Boland, an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies, also at the University of Alabama, and we both work in the Institute for Communication and Information Research, or the ICIR, at UA.
Okay, so we do need to acknowledge that a portion of this episode has already aired, and it aired without this intro where you learn a little bit more about who it is we're talking to. Here's us being transparent. We were overseas learning about biometrics and physiological research and had all these grand plans to be super productive with everything else going on in our lives. And sure enough, that productivity got lost on us. In short, we kind of forgot.
Okay. Yes, we forgot. Well, to be fair, we remembered, and then we forgot, and then we remembered, and then we forgot again. But because this is such a fun conversation and such an interesting one, we wanted to make sure that we shared it again with proper introduction so you can not only hear the episode again, but so we can hype up our guest before the conversation with him. But before we get into that introduction, we have to get a question in.
Yes, and not to give too much away with this question, but I do think it's an appropriate one. Here we go. Annalisa, when we think about the role of social media in our lives and think about information exchange and idea exchange, what value do you see in social media? Big, broad question there.
Okay, so this is an interesting question indeed. Okay, so value in social media. Okay, well, so it robs me of financial value because I see a product and then I buy it. Influencers don't seek me out. But for personal value, okay, so you and I share reels or stories or posts or all of those things or some of those things like all the time.
Yep.
And they usually consist of an animal doing a ridiculously cute thing or a place that we need to go get coffee or cake from. And I think the biggest value I get from social media is oh, look at that feels.
Yes.
Right? So I'll also admit that I do get some of my news from Twitter, maybe not great. And I'll say to people like, oh my gosh, did you see that story? And then when somebody says, no, I didn't, what's that about? I have to follow up with an admission of like, oh, I just read the tweet, not the story. And I think that can only be summarized by, it's me. Hi, I'm the problem. It's me.
Oh, well done. Well done. Well, our next guest won't argue about there being some value in social media. What he is going to tell us about is the role social media play in democracy. And he might, if he thinks his research has found if it's a good thing or not. We'll also dive into the bias we often see in news and how social media have created something called news deserts. Not desserts, news deserts.
Not cake.
That's right.
So we are going to cover a lot of territory in this conversation, and we don't want to hold off any longer. So please join us in welcoming Dr. Matt Barnidge, an assistant professor in the Department of Journalism and Creative Media. Welcome, Matt.
Matt, thank you so much for joining us today. We are thrilled to be able to catch up with you.
Well, thanks for having me on the show.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So we are going to start off with a couple quick, very low thinking questions. So first, okay, we're not going to ask you who you are, but where are you from?
I'm from Houston, Texas.
Okay. And what is it that you do now?
I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Journalism and Creative Media, and I research political media and public opinion.
All right.
Okay. So here's the fun question. What did the young Matt want to be when he grew up? Did you always have this professor gig in mind? Did you want to be a professional athlete? What did you want to be?
I wanted to be a musician.
Wow. Okay. Follow up on that.
So I played piano from an early age, and then switched to the guitar as a teenager, and then later on picked up the drums. And when I was in college at UT in Austin, I chose UT because Austin is such a great music town, and I was far more concerned with whether my band had a gig this weekend than I was with performing well in my classes. It's kind of ironic that I'm a professor now, and definitely when I graduated, I said to myself, "Oh, that's it for school. I'm done. I'm never going back." And 20 years later, here I am, still in school.
Okay, Matt. So, what was the name of your band?
Yes, I was gonna have to follow up with that.
That is, my first band was named Six Finger Joe, and it was named after our lead singer's dad, who apparently blew off 4 fingers with like a homemade pipe bomb or something when he was a kid. His name was Joe. The last band I was in was in Madison, Wisconsin. And it was an indie pop band called Automatically Yours.
Oh.
Yeah, they sang, it was a couple of 20-somethings in Madison who needed a drummer, and they were really into sort of jangly pop and love songs. Yours was the name.
Amazing.
Okay, so I do have to ask, do you have like a little side gig going where you may be showing up on stages or in places around town? Do we need to talk about this offline?
Oh, only in my daydreams at this point. Being an professor takes up most of your time, but no, I'm not playing with anyone at this point, though I would love to. So if you're listening to this and you say, "Hey, I really need a drummer and I live in Tuscaloosa," well, you can find me on the JCM website.
There you go. We'll put it all in the show notes if you need a drummer.
You be careful what you say.
Do you know anyone?
I mean, we've got some musicians here inside the college,
Mm-hmm.
and we have this. You might be included in the next. In the first recruitment email.
Maybe we should make a college band, the ICIR band or something.
It could be horribly wrong or amazingly great.
Yeah.
Okay, Matt, let's move on because you did mention that being a professor takes up a lot of time. So can you give us an elevator pitch about the research that you're working on?
Yeah, so my research has focused in 2 main areas. First is social media and democracy, and second, trust, credibility, and bias of political news media. And so right now I'm working on sort of connecting those things. So for example, linking declines in media trust with the rise of social media. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Okay, so we're going to dive into both of these, but can you tell us about one or a series of projects that you've done related to this decline in media trust? Because, on the outside, it's like, well, this makes sense with the rise of social media. There is going to be sort of increased levels of distrust, but what are you actually finding? Like, who are you studying? And tell us everything.
Yeah, so I've done a few big comparative survey projects. These are sort of cross-national, multi-country comparisons. And what I'm doing right now is trying to, find examples of countries where the declines in trust haven't been as steep as they have been here, and look for things that they're doing with their media system, with their media policy, for example, of public broadcasting or providing public subsidies to local newspapers or passing social media regulation. What are other countries doing, that have been relatively more successful than what we're doing here? And can we adapt some of those solutions to our own media system, to our own sort of journalism, so that we can maybe, start to, reverse the tide here.
Oh, the tide.
Did that answer? Yeah, do you like that? Not that the tide needs to be reversed, right?
Yeah.
Did that
Okay.
answer
I
the
have.
question?
Yeah, and I have a follow up here. We're gonna do like whatever you say. We're gonna have a million follow up questions. So most of the people that we have talked to thus far have not been constrained to, say, a young adult population that they're studying, but most people are studying people within the United States. So how did you get interested in the multiple countries, looking at this comparative type of research? How did that come about?
That's a great question. I mean, I guess it was probably born out of my own personal interests that, I had an older sister who traveled a lot, and I was watching her and said, oh, that's really cool. And I want to travel a lot. And so I started doing that after college. I sort of hit it at this perfect moment where it was, a plane travel was affordable. And yet a lot of these places you might go as a sort of shoestring backpacker maybe hadn't been overrun by folks chasing that Instagram image, right? So it was a sort of sweet spot in the early 2000s. It was really great for budget travel, and I did that for a number of years and spent a lot of time in Latin America and Europe and North Africa. And so when I went to grad school, I sort of gravitated toward, the scholarship that had an international focus. It also made sense to me that, a lot of the public opinion processes that we're most interested in really are pretty sensitive to the media environment. And we make assumptions about our media environment all the time. And those assumptions sort of shape our research. Exposure, for example, right? We say, okay, since maybe the 1990s, and possibly even since the 1980s, partisan media, especially on cable news, have become more prevalent. That sort of accelerated in the 2000s, and this has really changed the media environment, right? But what we don't do is, make actual observations about, variation across media systems, right? We make assumptions that shape our hypotheses, but we don't actually, usually when we do a single country study, we're not actually sort of putting those assumptions front and center and putting them to the test, right? Looking for maybe media environments where it's different, right? And do we see a different effect? And it's challenging because, of course, when you're talking about the difference between two countries, there are lots of things that could be different: culture, language, etc., population, economy. There's so many things that could be different. So it's really difficult to find a comparison that's sort of meaningful. But when you do, you gain leverage over those assumptions that we, all make when we're designing a single country study. A sort of benefit to doing this kind of comparative research. But, I will say I got interested in it because of my own personal experiences. Yeah.
I think sometimes the best research starts there, doesn't it? Okay, I have many questions. I'm going to try to limit it to two. I'm going to try to lump two together. So you had talked about the decline in media trust and the rise of social media. So my first question to that is, are you looking at different platforms of social media, and are you finding that trust is declining if you are on TikTok more or Instagram? So that's kind of the first part of the question. And then the second part of the question is, when you consider those platforms and how all or most of them are very algorithm based, how does that play into it? Because I feel like it's kind of designed to give us confirmation bias, you know? So I'm just wondering, and this can be based on what you've actually found, or you can speculate based on all of your knowledge.
Yeah, those are both great questions. So there are important differences between the major platforms, and those differences are, concern the sort of structure of communication and the structure of social connection, and those have important implications for the content that gets shared and the content that people encounter, the effects of that content on public opinion. That said, most social media platforms share several elements in common. And those elements are: you get to create a profile, you get to connect with other people who have a profile, and then you get to sort of traverse that list of connections, right? So you can move around the system. And those are the foundational elements that have really shaped communication on those platforms. And as we know, those platforms have become sort of major sources for news. So the differences between them are important, especially when thinking about algorithms and the way the platforms sort of computationally select content for users. But there are also important similarities, and to recognize that those similarities are foundational, that they're at the core of online communication these days. But to the second part of the question regarding algorithms, there was a shift in the early days of social media, thinking back to 2006, 2007, when it was sort of Facebook was sort of taking off and expanding beyond the .edu email addresses. It really was about connections, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't even think there was a news feed yet, and you really just went to somebody's page, and somebody could post a link to a news article, and that was interesting. But it was about what your friends were saying, right? Around 2008, maybe it was 2010, Facebook made a change to the news feed, and that really started to change things, because now all of a sudden you have this sort of aggregation function where you're taking stuff from the network and putting it into a single feed. And that raises questions of like, all right, what content are you going to show people first? What's first? What's second? What's not being shown at all? What's way down the list? And so from there was another major departure point where Facebook tweaked the algorithm after 2016. After the 2016 election and sort of the run up to that, there was a lot of people got frustrated, I think, with the amount of misinformation that was being shared, the amount of disagreement and hostility and incivility that was happening around political news and around the election. And so Facebook in particular made an important change, which was to, and they put a bunch of messaging out there saying we're making changes to emphasize quality interactions, right? But what that meant was interpersonal interactions, less interaction with media and news content, and more interaction with people and what they're posting and what they're thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But this sort of had the effect of hurting small publishers who had come to depend on Facebook as a platform for disseminating news, right? As especially local newspapers had sort of struggled to adapt to the digital environment. Facebook provided a ready side door where they could publish their content and get it in front of more eyeballs than they would otherwise, right? And this sort of had the effect of re-engaging significant segments of the population with the news and with the political sphere, right? When they made that change, suddenly that went away. And you had a concentration of attention to the biggest news organizations in the country. I think we did a study recently that shows, Fox News is actually really dominant on Facebook. They're followed by CNN, which is a distant second place. And the top five is rounded out by sort of the usual suspects: New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, right? And so most of the attention is going to these big national brands, and it's the small publishers that get hurt. And anyone who maybe had a blog or a newsletter and is trying to post that content on Facebook knows this all too well, right? You're not getting as much engagement as maybe you used to on those platforms. The platforms are different from Facebook to Twitter to Instagram and now TikTok. And TikTok in particular is really the more algorithmically driven than any other platform that came before it. And that's really starting to be a problem, I think.
He's on record.
Yeah, no, I think it is. When it's all about the algorithm, then you do lose that element of sort of incidental exposure, of incidental engagement with news and with politics. And then so you have, large segments of the public that are just sort of not getting any news or not getting any, political information at all. We have a hard time imagining that, I think, as journalism and mass communication scholars, because most of us, either worked in the news industry or are very interested in the news industry, and we're newsies, right? I know, I speak for myself. I wake up and, read as many news articles as I can before I do anything else that day, right? I'm sort of a news junkie, but not everybody is. And at this point on TikTok and to a lesser extent on some other platforms, it's taking on a rich get. If you're following political stuff, you're getting a lot of political stuff. If you're avoiding political stuff, you're getting none of it, right? Because the goal is to keep your attention and to keep you engaged. Questions about, like if my toddler just wants to eat candy all day, she's not going to grow very big and strong, right? She does need vegetables every now and then, and the public needs good information. The public needs news every now and then. Even if you don't want any, you still need some. And so there are questions if people are using this as their primary source of information. If there's an assumption that the news will find them somehow through their social networks, are those assumptions true? Are they still true? I think as we move toward this algorithmically driven, where it's has almost nothing to do with your connections and almost everything to do with your previous engagement on the platform, I think there are real questions about whether the platforms are creating news deserts where they're just people who aren't doing anything at all.
Okay, so I do want to go into this news deserts topic, but I don't want to say is this a yes or no question, but social media good for democracy?
No, not at this point.
Okay.
Not at this point. I think there was great potential for social media to do a lot of positive things for democracy, but the way it has gone, the way that these platforms have changed the structure of information to fit with their commercial exigencies. Let's say that they need to make money. The way they make money is by selling ads. They sell ads by convincing advertisers that their users are engaged. So the more they can get you engaged, the more they can sell ads and make money. So we went from a situation where these platforms promise to connect everybody and get everybody in conversation with one another. And we know there are a lot of benefits from that, right? So for example, the contact hypothesis suggests that you get two people who disagree with one another, get them in conversation, even a short conversation, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and they tend to moderate their views a little bit. They tend to grant points that the other side has made. They tend to say, oh, okay, yeah, maybe they're not so crazy. Maybe I see what they're saying, and maybe even if I don't outright change my opinion. I become a little more tolerant of the other side, right? Um, those kind of connections also have really positive benefits for spreading information, right? We know that information spreads through weak ties, people who you're only sort of loosely connected to. I've already heard everything that my close friends have to say, right? But my friend of my close friends may have something new to say. And so social media really promised to spread information far and wide. Um, Unfortunately, the changes that have been made to the platforms in order to monitor have really been detrimental to our information systems. They've really been detrimental to the news media industry. I think they've contributed to the concentration of attention. I think they're forming news deserts. I think they have been detrimental to civil society, as you know, we get in more and more arguments or disagreements. You know, we're actually feel our communities getting sort of torn apart rather than coming together, right? And of course, you can always find sort of counterexamples of this, and it does depend on how you use it, and all this stuff is true, right? So it's not like a hard determinism, like social media has killed democracy. Interacting with our society, it's interacting with our information system, it's interacting with our political system, and it's interacting with our social and political culture, right? And so I think on the whole, the sort of on average, the platforms at this point have shifted to be more of a drag on our democratic institutions, on our democratic processes, and definitely on our information system.
Okay, so I mean, yes, I can see that. I want to go into what you mentioned news deserts, and I mean, when I think about food deserts, it is a lack of places with a lack of access to good, healthy food, and it seems as though things like social media, cable news, would not would not lead to a inaccessible news. So what do you mean by news desert?
It comes from the food desert metaphor, right? So it's not that you're getting no food; it's that there's not a really good grocery store within walking distance, and I don't have a car, right? I would have to take the bus, and that's kind of a pain. So what do I do instead? I go to McDonald's, or I eat fast food, and that becomes my diet. And over time, that's really sort of unhealthy for me, right? It creates significant health problems. And this tends to particular communities more than others, right? And so you're seeing, scholars took that metaphor and applied it to local newspapers, as these newspapers sort of have been under more and more financial pressures, and more of them are closing and consolidating. You're getting areas with, maybe just one newspaper, or maybe even no newspapers. And this is creating sort of local news deserts where there just really isn't any information about your local community in this area. I mean, in Tuscaloosa, we're pushing in that direction at the Tuscaloosa News, which is, I think, down to 2 reporters. New digital startup, the Tuscaloosa Thread. And they're okay, they're getting some of the major stories, but they're reliant on intern labor, and I don't know how sustainable their model is. And they're certainly not doing any kind of in-depth reporting or holding public officials to account or anything like that. So that sort of leaves us with television, which tends to be a little more, a little lighter, a little more on the, I hate to say shallow, it's not shallow, but it tends to be a little more sort of positive and focused on community events, and it's not doing that, sort of hard-hitting watchdog journalism, right? And so there are questions about whether we're getting the news we need to get on a local level, and social media have certainly contributed to that problem. As I mentioned before, local newspapers are the ones that have really struggled since, especially since Facebook changed its algorithm or tweaked its algorithm 2015, 2016. And so, it's hard for us to imagine because, I'm imagining, Annalisa, that you probably get a lot of news and a lot of information on your social media feeds. But that's because you're connected to other people who are posting this stuff. It's because you are embedded in highly educated networks of people who have been socialized to care about politics and to care about public affairs. And it's likely because you've engaged with that content in the past. And so the platform is sort of reading you as being interested in news. And so it's showing you that news, right? But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that there are a lot of people out there who aren't that way, who aren't embedded in those networks. That sort of tends to track with real offline socio-demographic inequalities and inequities in our society, right? So if you're coming from a network and a community and a background where you maybe haven't been socialized into reading the news, you maybe haven't been taught that following politics is important and that it's an obligation, it's a duty, right? Or even if you were taught all those things, but you're just not really very interested, right? You'd rather talk about something else, your life or movies or sports, right? And, sure, maybe you get some political stuff, but by and large, you're not engaging with, expressly political content. And so the algorithms start to read you as uninterested and they stop showing you that stuff. And so there is a growing number of people who are living in digital news deserts. And the sad part is they think they're not. They think that the news will find them if it's really important. And the doubly sad part is that news organizations really have come to rely on these side doors like social media, like Google News, like news apps in order to attract an audience. I think only 19% of the American public has a digital news subscription to an online newspaper, right? That's less than 1 in 5 Americans actually sort of pays and subscribes to news, like goes directly to the New York Times website and reads news there because they pay for it, right? Most are reliant on these side doors. And so it's hurting the news industry and it's, creating a malaise and disengagement with politics and public affairs. I think that creates the space for what you might call anti-system actors and media organizations to try to capitalize on that malaise, right? When Donald Trump called the media the enemy of the people, he didn't do that in a vacuum. That message resonated with people for a reason, right? It's because the disengagement that did predate social media, right? But I think social media exacerbated, or at least they failed to close those gaps. That disengagement created a mistrust that is done, right? And I think you're seeing that in other places as well. So, for example, in Brazil, they just had their own January 6th, unfortunately, storm capital. Same type of situation. Bolsonaro, used people's pre-existing mistrust of the media as a political weapon, right? Online propagandists, folks who intentionally spread misinformation or disinformation, they know this and they're capitalizing on that and they're moving into that space, right? And so the mistrust creates, I think we tend to have this idea that, the reason people don't trust the media is because of Trump and politicians like Trump, right? They're fomenting mistrust. And while it's true they may be exacerbating the problem, it did predate those politicians, right? They moved in advantage of the space. They saw a political opportunity and they're rather unscrupulous about exploiting that opportunity. It's not just happening in the US, it's happening in Brazil, it's happening in Hungary. It's happening in Poland. It's happening in, well, something else is happening in Russia. It's happening in India. So it's happening all over the world. And what is the common underlying factor there? Well, it's the spread of social media that's been happening. You know, it's been happening in our country for longer, right? As these companies are based in the United States and their first audiences were in the United States, et cetera. But it really took off around the world, probably starting 2012, 2013. And that's sort of precisely the period in which we started to see declines in engagement and declines in trust.
Okay, I gotta say, Matt, we probably could keep talking for another 2 hours. We definitely have to get you back on for What's New with that series that we've just started. We have covered a lot of territory, but I feel like I've asked 3 of my 29 questions. And I didn't even get to, okay, my algorithm is showing me dog videos, food videos, and travel. So what does that say about me as a human and someone who's engaged? But we are at the wrap-up section of today's episode, at least. We'll definitely bring you back on and continue this. So what we're going to do is we're going to end with some recommendations from you. No pressure whatsoever. What's your favorite TV show, or what are you watching right now?
I just finished Fleischman is, and I loved it. I think it's pretty
Ooh, great. Okay.
All right. Next, what are you reading right now?
I am reading a book on European democracy, believe it or not, for fun, called Europe's 20th Century. Yes,
we should have prefaced it with truly for fun.
Maybe a more exciting recommendation along the same lines would be How Civil Wars Start.
Ooh.
By Barbara F. Walter, and I think it's just a really smart, really, really great piece of scholarship or summarization of a lifetime of scholarship by a political scientist named Barbara F. Walter.
We have very different definitions of what we consider fun reading.
Yeah.
What is a movie that we all need to see right now?
Oh, mostly I watch children's movies, so I would say Encanto. Love the music.
Yes, yes.
Corona, I love the music in Encanto.
Yes.
Okay. Final question is, if you were on a reality show, or if your life was a reality show, you picked a direction, what would that reality show be?
Ooh, wow. I would like it to be The Amazing Race, but
yes, I love that answer.
We are going to get we are going to have some sort of Amazing Race CIS version. Just
that would be awesome. Next time ICA is international, we'll set up a little world
right
race.
Now with those ideas.
Yes. Okay, so actually this is the final question, but it's based on something you'd said earlier. If you started a band today, what would the name be?
Ooh, that is a great question. I've always been really bad at band names. I don't know. I'm drawing a blank. Maybe, okay, I'll give you one. It was actually my trivia team name. We used to play, like bar trivia or whatever. Dead in the Water.
Yes. Okay.
Which I think would appropriately sum up our chances of, actually making it.
Matt, it has been so great talking with you today. We have learned so much, and I'm sure our listeners are sitting back and thinking, which is what we want them to do after these episodes. Thank you so much for taking the time in your day to chat with us and catch up.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed it.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.